Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
In 1957, Jung wrote the following: "The years of which I have spoken to you, when I pursued the inner images, were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer classification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. But the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then." And Jung, of course, is talking about his confrontation with the unconscious, which we have mentioned numerous times on the podcast, that began around 1913. He had broken with Freud, which had been very difficult for him. His whole kind of persona that he had built up for himself, his marriage, his work at the Berkeley, everything kind of wasn't working for him anymore. And he was having some very disturbing visions that were breaking through. And what he decided to do was to drop into the unconscious and begin dialoguing with those images. He kept these journals, known now as the Black Books, in which he cataloged these active imagination experiences. And then eventually he copied them into a leather-bound folio with red leather. And they're beautifully calligraphied writing and almost like a kind of book of Kells with these incredible drawings. And it was hidden in a vault for decades, was finally published in 2009. And we're going to talk a little bit today about Jung's Red Book. And one of the important things about the Red Book is the connection between exploring the unconscious and art, using drawing and other forms of creative expression to dialogue with the unconscious. And we'd like to invite you to consider joining us on September 13th for a special free seminar in which we're going to talk about a new addition to Dream School that we're calling Dream Studio. It's going to be a program that will unfold from this September through December of 2025 as our kind of first pilot, in which we will explore the use of art in dialoguing with our dreams. And we're taking our inspiration from Jung and the Red Book. So let's begin our exploration of this very important part of Jung's history.
So there's a couple of things that I think the Red Book introduced to us as Jungians, because it was held in reserve by his descendants, is that in part these images broke upon Jung. Yes, it happened around the time that he had separated from Freud, but also Jung was courting a way to observe the unconscious without any interference from the ego. So he was also experimenting with methods to listen deeply, to capture images that aren't being contaminated or manipulated by the ego, and that also, as well as the stress separating from Freud, courted and invited this upwelling of unconscious material. And then he'd kind of harpooned a whale, so to speak, and he was, kind of crashing through the waters, being dragged and driven by this incredibly powerful force that I don't think he really he understood what he was signing up for.
No, I agree that we don't know, exactly what we're going to get into, and Jung talks about that of that this was so big, and can I go there? Should I go there? What are the risks in going there? But he says that one of the greatest difficulties was dealing with my negative feelings. I was voluntarily submitting myself to emotions of which I could not really approve, writing down fantasies that struck me as nonsense and toward which I had strong resistances. As long as we don't understand their meaning, such fantasies are a diabolical mixture. It cost me a great deal to undergo them, but I'd been challenged by fate. And then he talks about only by extreme effort was I able to escape the labyrinth, which calls up the myth of the Minotaur. Of you can get into the labyrinth, but you can't get out. At least not without help from Ariadne. But things came to such a crux of intensity that he said on December 12th, to be exact, I resolved once upon the decisive step. I was sitting at my desk once more, thinking over my fears, and then I let myself drop, and it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and he had a fantasy. And I think really what he's talking about is, and it's hard to really understand it and accept it, is how powerful the unconscious is, and that it can make an unrelenting demand that will take you to the depths, which is what Jung did. And where we have the Red Book and Memories, Dreams, Reflections about his journey.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, sort of reading a little bit about the Red Book and in prep for this, I found myself thinking about the echo to an earlier time in his life when the unconscious made an unrelenting demand in the form of an image. And it was his teenage experience of being in front of the main cathedral there in Basel and having an idea, an image that wanted to emerge that he was fighting against. And finally, he couldn't fight against it anymore. And the image emerged of God sitting above the cathedral there, letting out a giant turd that shattered the roof. But it has a similar feeling that there was something pressing on him from within that seemed absurd or heretical or nonsensical. And he had to let himself have that inner experience and then contend with it. So he talks about the need to make sense of these images or at least to engage them so as not to be destroyed by them. So now when we read the Red Book, I mean, I have a colleague who's a psychoanalyst in a different tradition, different psychoanalytic tradition, and he was taking a class or something and he had been assigned parts of the Red Book, and he said, "What is this?" And I said, "Oh my God, you were assigned that? Like, that's not a good place to start." So I said, just let it wash over you. But the truth is that Jung apparently wanted the Red Book to be published in his lifetime, but it wasn't. And his heirs, as we've referred to, they locked it in a vault. And they had a lot of trepidation about allowing this to come forward because it is fairly bizarre. It is difficult to understand. It's strange. It's, you find yourself wondering, what was he smoking when he was writing this?
His pipe.
It's what was in the pipe, though. No, I mean, that's, in all seriousness, I think there's some debate about whether or not there were substances involved, and I personally don't think so, but I know that Jungians like to speculate about that. But in all seriousness, it is the content is fairly bizarre. It's not your typical psychoanalytic treatise. And so the family, they were really concerned about what it might do to his reputation. There were many people who wanted to see it, but the family kept it held really fast until Jungian scholar Sonu Shamdasani was able to negotiate with the family to allow this to be published. And in what I think is it's really interesting because Norton and Company published it in 2009, and I actually have my copy here. And it was, I think the original cost was like $200. It's big.
It's big.
Yes. And I think they initially, Deb, was it 6,000 copies that they published?
Yes, 6 was the original run because of the expense, and now something like 50,000 have been sold and still going strong.
Yeah, it still sells well. There's still a fascination with it. People find it moving, and I think the reason for that is we all have a red book in us. We all have a rich inner life, and it's so extraordinary that he took the time, he valued his inner life, and took the time to make this beautiful document. That brought it out to life.
And I think you've just said it, and I'm just paraphrasing. What Jung gave us is a portrait of the unconscious. The art and the paintings, the visions, the calligraphy, the verbal, the actual printed content, there is the unconscious that was in Jung and in all of us. It will come through to each of us differently. But there it is. That's part of our human condition. It's huge. It's a huge question as to how much of it can we experience, how much of it can we record, how much of it can we make meaning of, how much can we render into consciousness.
So just throwing up one of the images from the Red Book, and we'll do this a few times throughout the podcast, just to give you a sense of what the images look like. And you can see here some of the calligraphy, and some of it really actually looks like a sort of illustrated manuscript from the Middle Ages. So let's talk for a minute about some of the main ideas that come out of the Red Book. There are two principal figures that Jung winds up dialoguing with. One of them is Salome, and the other is Philemon. And Philemon kind of becomes a sort of ghostly guru who guides Jung. And curiously, Philemon refers to this story of Philemon and Baucis that is in Ovid's Metamorphosis, and they're a married couple. Somehow Baucis, the wife, doesn't make it into Jung's imaginations, but Philemon becomes extremely important.
The myth of Philemon and Baucis, just to quickly retrace it, is that Zeus and Mercury Hermes were in disguise as just visitors looking for a place to spend the night. And in ancient Greece and around the Mediterranean, hospitality was an incredibly important value. You really needed, as a traveler, to be taken in, or you might not survive. So they go into this town, and nobody will take them in. And they finally go into the outskirts, and this very poor couple, Philemon and Baucis, take them in and offer them the best that they have. She scrubs the table, wipes it down with fresh herbs, prepares a meal. She's about to go out and slaughter there are only goose in honor of honoring the guest and hospitality value, and they stop her. And at the meal that is then served, at some point, they notice that the pitcher holding the wine has never emptied. And they realize that they're in the presence of gods who reward them by turning their home into a temple with 2 trees overarching the temple whose branches intertwine. They asked to die at the same time, and the wish was granted.
And they were turned into these 2 trees.
You're right. The trees came later. Sorry about that. But it's interesting that of all of the figures that could have populated Jung's fantasies, it was Philemon.
And we have this image of Philemon here that I'll share. This is this image that came to Jung in one of his dreams or active imaginations of Philemon with these enormous kingfisher wings. And so this is one of the figures that he dialogued with in these active imaginations.
And Jung said that as he walked up and down in his garden in active imagination, talking with Philemon, that Philemon told him things that he could not possibly have known from personal experience, which is a really radical thing to say about the unconscious and the collective unconscious, that there is something universal and something beyond personal experience that we can nevertheless access individually.
So Jung was discovering something which I think has been experienced for perhaps even thousands of years prior, that in this mundus imaginalis, in this imaginal world, that there are inner figures that have an autonomous, independent life from the ego. And while Jung was aware of this kind of archaeologic and anthropologic and religious texts, he himself hadn't experienced it for himself beyond just what happens in dreams. So this was Jung's initiation into this profound autonomy of these psychological figures. And as you were saying, Deb, that can know things which Jung in no credible way could have known himself, and that Jung took in and saw as fodder for his entire psychological theory and his own process of becoming whole. So one of the core ideas of individuation is that the psyche is holding in reserve essential information, and if we can engage it in a meaningful way, that the personality is enlarged, that we come to hold consciously things that we could know if the ego could find a way to set its defenses aside and to look and hear more deeply. Now, Jung came to think that this ultimately was more powerful than dream work, that going in this dialectic with the inner figures caused these remarkable changes and ultimately a kind of healing and restoration of his true personality with a speed and intensity that dream work didn't seem to bring to him. Dream work, my sense is, dream work for him became a kind of softer second cousin to active imagination work. But he also recognized that active imagination is difficult. It's difficult to cultivate that liminal thin place in the psyche.
So in addition to Philemon, the other important figure was Salome. And of course, this becomes an image of his soul, and his experiences with Salome form the basis of his later thinking about the anima. And I just want to read one of the passages that occurs early in the Red Book, because it really does, in some sense, it is the theme of the book, is the sort of redemption of the soul. This is from the Red Book. He says, When I had the vision of the flood in October of the year 1913, it happened at a time that was significant for me as a man. At that time, in the 40th year of my life, I had achieved everything that I had wished for myself. I had achieved honor, power, wealth, knowledge, and every human happiness. So at this point, remember, he would have been Freud's heir apparent. Then my desire for the increase of these trappings ceased. The desire ebbed from me and horror came over me. The vision of the flood seized me and I felt the spirit of the depths, but I did not understand him. Yet he drove me on with unbearable inner longing, and I said, "My soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call you. Are you there? I have returned, and I am here again. I have shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I have come to you. I am with you. After long years of long wandering, I have come to you again. Should I tell you everything I have seen, experienced, and drunk in? Or do you not want to hear about all the noise of life and the world? But one thing you must know, the one thing I have learned, is that one must live this life." So that's just so beautiful and moving to me. And, just to think that that was sitting in a vault for decades, and what must it have been like to fish that out and to find that so poignant, that here at this kind of midpoint in his life when he was such in a crisis, to realize that he had abandoned his soul. And, I think that's something that probably a lot of us can relate to.
Very, very much so. And he says in other places, he doesn't want people to follow him and to do as he did. He wants people to live their own lives, which of course ties in with his concept of individuation, of if you come with a blueprint for what your fullest development is, to find and follow and fulfill that blueprint for becoming the most biggest, most whole you that you can be. But what an amazing injunction to say, live your life. What does that call us to, aside from, getting the oil change in your car and keeping up with the mortgage payments? It's a huge question.
He writes, "There is only one way, and that is your way."
Mm. And I think that when we get to the end, and I always like what Jung says at the end of his life, it's so incredibly moving, because whatever else anybody might ever want to say about Jung, he lived his life.
Yeah.
He says it's been bountiful and given me a great deal. How could I ever have expected so much? I'm disappointed, not disappointed. I've learned amazing things. The older I've become, the less I've understood or had insight into. So I don't really quite believe, but that's okay. I'm astonished, disappointed, pleased with myself. I'm distressed, depressed, rapturous. But there is someone who lived his life, and he's writing this toward the very end of his life. And I would imagine that we all might like to be able to say such similar things of, man, I lived it. I made the most of what life offered me. I made the most of myself and my inner self. I really was in touch with my own depths.
So in this period, Jung is having dreams, he's having these visions, he's engaged in active imagination, and he's writing them down, the dreams and the visions, and he's drawing them. So he is using art, he's using visual imagery as a way to come into relationship with these images, he really felt that he might be destroyed if he didn't find some way to relate to them. And he felt such pressure to respond to these visions that he thought to himself that he would commit suicide if he couldn't find a way to live with them. And he kept a loaded revolver in his night table drawer. So the way that the unconscious can come to us, can exert all of this pressure, whether it's in a dream or a vision, and that we can find a way to dance with them through the use of visual imagery. And of course, Jung had some artistic talent. I mean, some of these images that we've been showing are quite remarkable, but it's not about the artistic rendering. It's about the act of engagement. And I think that that's one of the things that we want to explore in Dream Studio. So again, we invite you to come join us on September 13th for a free webinar about creativity and the unconscious, and then to consider joining Dream School, where we're going to make this an offering. But I want to talk a little bit about one of the kind of principal incidents in the Red Book. One of the important, maybe I shouldn't say principal, because there were several and they go into great depth. But one of the really important visions that he had, he titled it "The Murder of the Hero," and of course he does talk about this also in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. But I thought we could read a little bit of this just to kind of give you a sense of what are some of these images that he's having. So he says, "On the following night, however, I had a vision. I was with a youth in high mountains. It was before daybreak. The eastern sky was already light. Then Siegfried's horn resounded over the mountains with a jubilant sound. We knew that our mortal enemy was coming. We were armed and lurked beside a narrow rocky path to murder him. Then we saw him coming high across the mountains on a chariot made of the bones of the dead. He drove boldly and magnificently over the steep rocks and arrived at the narrow path where we waited in hiding. As he came around the turn ahead of us, we fired at the same time, and he fell slain. Thereupon I turned to flee, and a terrible rain swept down. But after this, I went through a torment unto death, and I felt certain that I must kill myself if I could not solve the riddle of the murder of the hero. Then the spirit of the depths came to me and spoke these words. The highest truth is one and the same with the absurd. This statement saved me, and like rain after a long hot spell, it swept away everything in me which was too highly tensed." So we know that he considered this vision to be incredibly important. And as I mentioned, he also writes about it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. But what on earth does that vision mean?
Well, you know what Jung talks about, I mean, first of all, is he talks about this intense pressure from the unconscious demanding that he pay attention to this. And he woke up and a voice said, "You must understand this dream and must do so at once." And that he had the loaded revolver in his bedside table. And the voice said, if you don't understand this dream, you must shoot yourself. Well, of course, Jung chose to understand the dream. And the understanding that ensued was that the attitude embodied by Siegfried, the great Germanic hero, no longer suited me, says Jung. Therefore, it had to be killed. And he said he felt the grief a man feels when he's forced to sacrifice his ideal and his conscious attitudes. The identity and heroic idealism had to be abandoned, for there are higher things than the ego's will. Of course, I'm thinking about his relationship with Freud as he embarked on this awful and momentous and revelatory period of his life, that resulted in the Red Book, and he talks about it in MDR. What a huge thing this was, spurred by the break with Freud was a huge turning point, and what that father-son relationship and Jung's designation as Freud's crown prince. He was Siegfried to Freud in many ways.
In the Norse myths, the name of Siegfried's father was Sigmund.
There are facets, permutations, layers and depths to all of this, and that turning point from the heroic to Psyche, to what is going on within, what is wanted for Jung and from Jung besides achieving. And you read that part, Lisa, before about where he said, I've had everything. I've had the acclaim, the success, the power, the intellectual knowledge. I think this, for me, in a way, is the heart of Jung's journey as portrayed in the Red Book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, all kinds of his writings. Is, what is it all about? Where it's a huge search for meaning in the modern world, and how necessary, now I'm not going to say important, necessary it is to go within and rediscover, let's call it God or the God archetype, the source, the self, goes by many names, but we must discover it within ourselves.
Part of the discovery of that interiority and its autonomy is that all of us, when we're young, that the unconscious provides a lot of energy for us to take risks, to be full of ourselves, to develop some swag, to launch, to go out there in the world and try new and big things. And it is a kind of inflation that carries us out of the nest and into the hard work of being in life. And when Jung was touring with Freud in the United States, he kind of took this steamliner across. There were lots of accounts of Jung being really very difficult. He was kind of strutting around. He was kind of full of himself. He was making a lot of big, broad pronouncements and was hard to like, actually, during that lecture, apparently. And that's a natural part of kind of being a little big for our britches, kind of having the audacity to do the things that he was doing and to put them forward. But one of the transitions that Jung talks about is when the time is appropriate in midlife, that the heroic inflation, where this archetypal energy carries us into life, has to be set aside for wisdom to then present itself. So one way to summarize the killing of Siegfried, which he experienced as a kind of order, that he was given the order to do this even though he didn't understand it, is that by killing off that heroic self-inflation, that he had learned to serve images rather than rule them. And that was an enormous change in humility. So at first, there's the exaltation of the hero, then there's the killing of the hero, and then there is the resurrection of a God image in a form that the ego can tolerate without becoming overwhelmed. And he suggests that that's where his mature creativity had come forward. It's when he realized that his creativity was not private property, but a kind of collective energy that moved through him, and that his creativity was demanding relationship, not appropriation. And that when he really experienced that, there was a whole new level of creativity and productivity at a different dimension in himself that came forward.
I just want to throw up a picture of maybe an image of the hero. But Deb, go ahead and say what you want to say.
Well, what I'm thinking about is, I love that one. is what Joseph said, and realizing that there is something that undergirds and guides and is much bigger than the ego, of the mystery of how we talk about, the self or the God within or on and on. Maybe it can be summarized as, what is it that you're really serving in your life? What are you serving? What are you giving yourself to? And is it your own idea of, status, glory, power, the list goes on and on, or are you living for something greater than yourself? It could be, for your family. It could be, to move something in the outer world forward that you really believe in, an organization, some kind of service. But what are you in service to?
Or you could be in service to the job of individuation and attending to the inner life.
And I think they work together, that what you're in service to in the outer world gives you an idea of where your own individuation is taking place in the inner world. But individuation, as Jung says, takes us out into the world. So there are clues about, what's really important to me? What am I really doing? Am I trying to dominate and be Siegfried and be heroic? Or am I giving myself to something that I believe is greater in some sense?
Just to elaborate on the Siegfried imagery in Jung's particular biography at the moment as well. What I imagine is that to have risen so far, he's certainly had a reputation of his own by the time he met Freud, but his cachet kind of went up a lot when he became the crown prince. And but he had to sacrifice his own convictions to be in that relationship in that way. And this does come across, Joseph, you referenced their trip across the Atlantic together. There was, he talks about it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that there was some real tension there, but he had to really compromise himself in some sense to be in that relationship in that way. Freud really kind of demanded a certain submission to his doctrines. And so there were, I think, many different levels in which, the 39, 40-year-old Jung had abandoned himself and betrayed himself. And in some ways, as you were alluding to, Deb, focusing more on these sort of outer world projects and leaving his soul behind. But also, very importantly, he had a vision of the psyche, of what was required of us for psychological growth and wholeness that he was not developing as he was in Freud's shadow, because Freud basically forbade it and kind of demanded adherence to his own views. And that is what kind of caused the split, which resulted in, Jung lost a lot of professional cachet. He lost a lot of connections. He was effectively kind of like canceled. And that can be, and was for him, really quite devastating. So being the hero had come at a cost in this very kind of specific way, that it had cost him his own convictions, and it had required a sort of self-betrayal.
So I think that whether it's, killing off the way that Freud's ideas had colonized him, as well as killing off a general heroic attitude in himself that might even be normal for a young man.
Right.
That Jung was required by something deeper than himself to separate out from these highly influential ideas and people and be cast into a kind of internal cauldron, so to speak. And if we think about the heroic attitude versus something that Jung cultivated subsequent to these inner experiences is the hero thinks that he's the one doing it. That the hero is the one that I'm going to go and do this amazing thing, and I'll climb that mountain and I'll overturn this terrible regime or whatever it is, or take the culture by storm. So there's a lot of support for that, and we like to see heroes in our movies. We like the idea of ourselves being heroic. Joseph Campbell in The Hero with 1,000 Faces venerates the idea of the hero to a remarkable degree. And that was good for Jung, I think, as for the amount of time that it was good for him. But Jung, like all, I think, in my estimation, like all mystics, at a certain point are forced to recognize that they are not a person, that they are a field within which events occur, that the human personality is a space, and that a play of forces enter into it. One of the ways that he communicates this, there's many ways he communicates a bit, but one is when he talks about thoughts, that thoughts were like birds that have their own independent life, and that they might land in his mental landscape. He would very hurriedly record them because he had a sense that they could fly away at any point, that they had an autonomous energy in and of themselves. Now, that may sound like a cute, poetic image, but for Jung, he really believed that, and he behaved in a way that was congruent to that his role was to be the scribe, and in some ways, the translator of these autonomous experiences into a language that the culture or his culture could relate to. Now, it's one thing to say that thoughts are like birds, or that the human personality is actually a field, not a singular thing, but to actually experience that as true so that he could then speak to it with authority involved a massive deconstruction of who he thought he was and how he thought he functioned, and the great crucifixion that he refers to on and off throughout his language, that whatever he used to be, he had to suffer that extraction of what he thought he was, and to yield into this relationship with these other factors inside of himself, some of which were collective. The collective unconscious, when he would brush against it, could threaten to overwhelm him, as well as some intimate and personal things like Salome, who was an intimate part of his own psychology. And interestingly, Salome first presents as blind, that his soul is symbolized as a wise but blind figure, and over the course of his engagements, Salome's sight is returned to her. Now, one way that we can imagine that is that when we are trapped in the young and heroic position, there's a way in which your soul is dependent on the personality to tell it what is true. And then it elaborates on that. And that can trap us in a kind of echo chamber, that I tell the anima what's true, and the anima then elaborates that. And then we have a kind of masturbatory creativity.
Mm-hmm.
For the soul to rediscover its own eyes means that the soul, as the linking function, can see things that the ego has never considered or conceived of. And then she would share that with Jung, and that was a revelation that she was going far beyond what he was providing. And that was so beautifully symbolized in the return of vision to that part of himself.
I really like and want to just kind of go back to highlight it, this idea of the personality as a space. And the space that Jung had the ability to go to in his active imaginations and encounters with Philemon and Salome, and to risk all that and translate it for us in the Red Book with all the accompanying art. And it doesn't look scholarly. It doesn't look linear. It doesn't make sense. And that's partly why it was so sequestered for so long. Jung was, certainly wanted to be seen as a scientist, a phenomenologist, and a psychologist, and a doctor, which he was. And this stuff, from the point of view of standard Western, perhaps heroic ego, does look wild, and it does look kind of far out there.
Here's one more image that I just thrown up on the screen here. You can see the serpent at the roots of the tree, and there's this sort of mandala here. It's an extraordinary image. I think that again, the importance of the Red Book to the Jungian community, to Jungian scholarship, to our understanding of the development of his ideas is, it's just extraordinarily significant. And we're so grateful that it was published. I remember I was in training when it was published and how excited we all were. And
oh, it was huge.
it was on display at the Reuben Museum in Manhattan, and I trekked up there to see it. But I think that it's also so important for all of us, as we said before, because it illustrates sort of a method for engaging with the inner life. Jung kept it on a stand in his office for his patients to see, and I think it was instructive. And here's how you can do this. It doesn't have to look like this. We all might have our own Red Books, and they might not all be read, and they might not all have similar drawings, but a testament, a document of our commitment to our inner life.
And how vibrant, how real, how prolific, how generative. We're not talking about something incidental, something small, but here's how deep you go. Here's how much there really is. This landscape is vast and huge and rapturous and distressing and difficult and rewarding. And I think very, very altogether, it is very reassuring to know that we do live, whether we know it or not, in this kind of landscape. We are part of something that we'll never comprehend fully. It's also a question as to how much we ever really get in touch with some of it. But there it is. We live in a landscape that is more than our conscious selves. It's just a fact.
And is influencing us, which I think is so important.
Yeah.
That this isn't just navel gazing, but that, as you're walking around and you're feeling very intensely about any number of things, to be able to pause and to wonder what is happening inside of me. And so people will do that all the time, but often, for instance, somebody will be uncomfortable, and then they will scan the outer environment, and if they notice something in their proximity, they will attribute their discomfort to that thing that's in proximity. I was feeling panicky, and I looked up and I saw my neighbor's dog off the leash. It's the dogs off the leashes. That's got to be the cause. But central to all psychodynamic work, but certainly Jung, is to decide, no, that there is something going on which can be an elaborate internal fantasy. Now, for Jung, fantasy didn't mean kind of self-constructed, but something happening that is fantastical inside of the internal environment. And if we can catch a glimpse of that and not truncate it, that we can come to understand something at play inside of ourselves that is independent of the external environment and, more importantly, independent of who you think you are. And that takes an enormous discipline to be able to see that we are a small thing in a vast starry canopy that lives inside of us and outside of us.
That's beautiful, Joseph. So Jung's invitation to us is to make these images come alive. And our invitation to you is to join us on September 13th for a taste of Dream Studio, our new addition to our dream school. So I hope you'll come along and hear more about how creativity can support engagement with the unconscious. And I also want to just sort of let people know that, the Red Book is for sale. It's not cheap, but it's beautiful. It's a wonderful thing to have. However, there's also a reader's edition. So you can simply buy the text, and that is also edited with an introduction by Sonu Shamdasani, and it's a little bit easier to read because it's certainly difficult to read something this size, and at the same time, it's pretty easy to find the images from the Red Book online, so you can go in search of those and enjoy those even without buying the big folio book. Although if you have an itch to own it, of course, I support that.
It's pretty splendid.
It is. And so perhaps we'll now switch to a dream. And for our Dream Studio, Dreams and Creativity webinar on the 13th, we've been soliciting from you your dreams and images that you may have made from those dreams. And we've gotten so many fascinating dream images sent for the Dream Studio seminar. So we thought we'd share some on the podcast today to give you a flavor of that session. So for this week's dream, in addition to the usual dream, we also have an image. Okay, so the dreamer is a 44-year-old woman who is a stay-at-home mother and an artist. And here's the dream. I'm in a green field with a friend who has a beautiful, chubby toddler with her. I have to make them dinner. I turn to a large wooden structure with a thatched roof and dirt floor. I think it's an ancient Celtic structure. Inside the dark room is an enormous cauldron suspended from the ceiling, much bigger than I am. And beneath the cauldron is white gray ash where a fire would be. It is vast and still and silent, and I am awed by it. I don't know how to make dinner with it, nor how to get the fire started. As I stare, it slowly starts to move like a pendulum, making a deep, metallic scratching sound. I panic, thinking that my staring has caused it to move. Then I turn and my friend is by the cauldron, which is now much smaller. She is thrusting her hands into bubbling primordial slime emerging from the cauldron. She is pregnant and smiling. I tell her not to do that, alarmed. She smiles and says, "Sorry," but I know she doesn't mean it. So, for associations, the dreamer notes, the friend is a real person who I was friends with at uni, but we are not in touch now. She was very beautiful and desired, and she went on to marry and have 4 sons. I would say she probably represents fecundity. Context, she says, I had this dream after Christmas, having run numerous Christmas fairs. I had not prioritized my creative work in months. I'm a mother of 3 kids, and I care for elderly parents, too. Christmas is joyous, but depleting on every level. I was feeling lost creatively and burnt out. And for feelings, She says, I felt happiness in the green field, then awe and dread at the sight of the cauldron, and physical anxiety when it started to move. Annoyance at my friend for messing things up and saying sorry, but not meaning it. And then she offers us a note about her process. She says, I drew the image in charcoal first, very soon after having the dream. I then drew it digitally and had it printed A3 size. I then drew over the print in charcoal again, made ash out of ground pastels, and made a roof out of cardboard and twigs collected from the garden. This process highlighted how deadened the image was. And thinking about it, a reference to something having once grown or been on fire and now extinguished. That certainly wasn't immediately apparent to me when I first had the dream. So we can see this really compelling image that the dreamer has offered us.
What I'm really paying attention to is the contrast between the image that the dreamer drew, which is, in grays, earthy materials, the shadow inside the cauldron and the white ash, and the images in the dream of generativity and growth and life and just aliveness. It starts out with, I'm in a green field with a friend who has a beautiful, chubby toddler with her. So a green field is where things are growing. A chubby toddler is bubbling with life and health and all of that good stuff. And then our dream ego is seized with, oh my gosh, how do I do this? I have no idea what to do. There's the gray ash. I don't know how to make dinner with this. I don't know what to do. And then at the end, the dream is bracketed by these two things at the beginning and at the end. Her friend is by the cauldron, which is now smaller, more approachable, more doable, more available to working with. And the friend is thrusting hands into this primordial slime and is pregnant, which reiterates the image at the beginning of the dream where she has a chubby toddler. So she's also about to have another baby. And the dream ego says, wait a minute, don't do that. But we have the contrast between the dream ego and perhaps some of the image that's rendered in this picture that the dreamer sent, and the shadow figure who is well at home in the green field, has a toddler, is pregnant, and is very comfortable putting her hands into the primordial slime.
Yeah, Deb, I think you've lifted up this sort of chief tension or contrast between the dream ego and the other woman that you identified as a shadow figure, and I would agree with you there. And you're right. It's sort of like, dreams often tell us about the relationship between the conscious attitude and the other parts of us within. And this dream does that, fabulously, right? The ego is in a place that feels lifeless, desiccated, dark. There's no fire. But there is another part of the dreamer, and it's not even that far away or hard to access. It's a friend. Of course, what I'm also really struck by, in addition to everything that you lifted up, is that she has a task. Her task is to make dinner for them. So I kind of like that the ego needs to be in service to this other part.
The ego needs to feed them, needs to nurture them, the ego needs to be able to go toward them and doesn't know how to do it. I don't know how to do this. And I also like very much about, here we're talking from the dream ego's point of view, we're talking about I have to make dinner. And from the point of view of the unconscious, what is in the cauldron is primordial slime. It's not beef bourguignon. It's not some sort of fabulous sauce of some kind. It's slime. And we often turn away from those images that are aversive to our ego stance of bugs and mud and slime and ooze and spiders, and I don't want that. But everything, this is classic Jungian stuff. It's the prima materia. It's the primordial, chaotic gunk. The lotus blooming in the mud.
What I'm hearing from you guys makes sense. As always, I'm asking myself, where is the medicine for the dream ego? Where's the medicine in the dream? And where is the conflict there? So I think, Jed, that you were leaning into that. There's a primordial substance that has been discovered in the cauldron that the friend is able to thrust hands into the unconscious, the prima materia, the primordial, and is smiling about it. And the dream ego says, don't do that. So that's the tension between the two figures. That figure number 2 is pleasurable for her to put her hands into the primal substance and tactily and sensately engage it. But the dream ego thinks that's something that should be stayed away from. Now, we don't have her here to know what's alarming about this. Is it because it's bubbling? Is she worried she's going to get sick or that it's too hot? That would all be interesting information if she had recorded that. And then the other woman mollifies her in a way that the dream ego knows is not sincere. But the alarm is what I'm really interested in. Why is it alarming to touch the primordial level inside of herself, which is what we would say is the collective unconscious, and is the realm of the archetypes? So when we are divorced from that layer of the psyche, it can be quite difficult for us to feel creative or to feel like we've got a lot of energy beyond what our egos can drum up metabolically. But that's where we get the big ideas, the big energies to carry us into big tasks, for instance. So whatever is causing the alarm, I think, is the place to lean into and wonder, what is the attitude that makes that so alarming, and that the dream friend has somehow overcome that alarm inside of her and seems to be having a good time, seems to be experiencing pleasure with the ooze.
Another important element of this dream, of course, is the cauldron, which is sort of a huge image, right? We associate cauldrons with witches, but they are very feminine and round. They're generative. It's where something happens. It's kind of like the alchemical vase. It's where things are transformed. It's where things are cooked. So it's and of course it seems very positive in the dream that there is this huge cauldron. There's like a space to really cook something. The problem is that there's no fire there now. But Joseph, and I think this kind of goes back to something that you were saying earlier in the episode, the cauldron also begins to move, like it has an autonomy. If the cauldron is in some sense an image of a creative function, it responds to the conscious ego, but it's not under the ego's control. It's not simply inert, right? It has a kind of life and will of its own. And it is interesting that it kind of shrinks down to a more manageable size when the friend is there. It's sort of like, this does feel a little daunting, and we really get that in the image. That would be too big to try to cook something in. You'd at least need a ladder. But it becomes something that we could really work with when the shadow energy is relating to it. It becomes more generative, and it, as you both pointed out, it's got this wonderful slimy ooze that could give rise to any number of things.
And just as an aside, and I'm imagining as a stay-at-home mom, she may have come across this, there is this playful substance called slime. You can buy it like it's next to the Play-Doh in the toy store. And kids love it. It's this big gelatinous wad that you can slop out of a little bucket, and kids stick their hands in it. They love to play it, throw it around. But there is something very tactily fascinating about this gooey, slimy toy.
And parents are at the very least ambivalent about it, because it gets all, from the point of view of grandchildren, it gets all over everything. Parents, okay, that's enough. That's enough. Okay, put it away.
Right. Just like the dream ego. Stop that.
Exactly.
Right. Don't be messy. But creativity is messy, isn't it? And it's lovely that the dreamer let herself, I'm imagining, be a little messy when she made this drawing. She's crushing the whatever it was that she said, the pastels to make the ash, and she's finding stuff from the garden. So
another piece that also is subtle but could be helpful in the dream is just something, the shrinking of the cauldron, just that one thing. Because for context, she says, I had this dream after Christmas. Having run numerous Christmas fairs, I'd not prioritized my creative work. I'm the mother of 3 kids, caring for elderly parents. Christmas is joyous and depleting. So if we take the cauldron as a symbol of the Great Mother, that it's too big, that there's so much mothering and caregiving that's going on in her life on so many different domains, that it becomes the impossible gaping maw of the cauldron that she doesn't know how to possibly fill, how to cook with it, what to do with it. It's the too muchness of the cauldron. And so as the friend starts relating to it with a smile, the cauldron becomes smaller, becomes relatable, becomes less mythic. Like, you don't have to feed the masses. You don't have to make enough food for 300 people in a cauldron the size of your body. How about you just have a small cauldron and you just make some pudding, or make a little bit of something.
Get a slow cooker.
Yes, make it manageable, and do it with a smile. So just that shrinking down to a manageable size, I think, has to do with mediating the archetype and maybe moving away from that feeling she's had post-Christmas that she has to provide everything for everyone, and it's just too big a task. So, yeah, shrink it down. Make it ordinary. Make it small.
the other thing I want to do is just to acknowledge, given our topic today, this woman is a mom of 3 kids who's caring for elderly parents. She's, I'm sure, got a lot going on every day. And yet she took the time to create this image. And we heard about her process. It wasn't a slapdash process. She really gave herself to this. So she's doing exactly what Jung was doing in the Red Book, which was really devoting herself to the inner life. And it's very moving to me to see this. There's no reason to do this other than to honor that connection with the unconscious. So to remind everyone, we are having a free webinar on September 13th, and you can find more information in the show notes. We're going to be discussing further this very important notion of creativity and the unconscious, and how creativity can help us explore our dreams. So I hope to see you all there. Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.